Hello, my name is Jessica Reed, and today I'm going to be discussing warlordism and Islamic extremism in Somalia, growing threats to U.S. economic interests. So over the last few decades, Somalia has been a nation characterized by widespread poverty, violence, and general hopelessness. The sub-Saharan African nation has often been dubbed the most dangerous place on the planet, and does not appear to be proving this title wrong anytime soon. The overwhelming presence of brutal warlords across the country has left the majority of the Somali population displaced, starving, and embittered. And consequently, many Somalis have turned to Islamic radicalism for comfort and purpose. Both the widespread presence of Islamic radicalism and brutal warlords threatens U.S. economic interests in Somalia and the surrounding region. U.S. foreign policies addressing these threats have often proven mildly effective, and have often caused more harm than good. If these policies were to be reevaluated and adapted, however, a greater progress in the stabilization of Somalia and the protection of U.S. economic interests could possibly be achieved. U.S. foreign policy towards Somalia has changed dramatically over the last several decades. The events that unfolded in Mogadishu in 1993 led to a drastic change in the way the U.S. approached the conflict. Large-scale humanitarian aid efforts were soon replaced with more subtle, clandestine methods of addressing the conflict. The CIA, for example, has maintained a significant influence in Somalia for decades through the funding of specific warlords as well as training Somali troops. The main goals of these policies are to seek out and minimize Islamic radicals, and this is apparent through the use of drone strikes to eliminate high-value targets. For the CIA involvement in Somalia has been a continuous controversy, however, particularly in the pursuit of Islamic radicals, as many believe the CIA's relationship with warlords is just perpetuating the instability within Somalia. Funding these warlords often leads more embittered and alienated Somalis living under the tyranny of these warlords to join Islamic radical groups, so it's almost counterproductive what the CIA is striving to do. Furthermore, funding and supporting these warlords only damages and threatens U.S. economic interests, as many Somalis living under the rule of these warlords seek out illegal opportunities and activities such as piracy in an effort to survive. And this clearly affects U.S. economic interests as well as the greater international community. So it's clear the U.S. defense strategists will need to rethink the CIA's role across Somalia. So along with clandestine missions, U.S. policies towards instability in Somalia have also been characterized by conventional operations. One such operation includes the U.S.'s involvement in NATO's Operation Ocean Shield, which, through the use of warships and aircraft, have aimed to police the waterways around the Horn of Africa and more specifically the Gulf of Aden. This operation has met with considerable success by significantly reducing the number of hijacks, attacks, and disruptions throughout the Gulf of Aden. Along with these piracy minimization efforts, the U.S. has also sought to protect American interests by striving to establish a legitimate government within Somalia. More specifically, this came in the form of supporting the Ethiopian invasion of 2006. Unfortunately, this policy led to considerable negative attention, as this invasion was perceived as a violation of Somalia's sovereignty, and the U.S. became associated with the transitional national government, who was accused of widespread corruption throughout Somalia. But aside from this negative policy, the U.S. has contributed significant amounts of aid to Somalia. Particularly in 2012, the U.S. contributed $545 million to the stabilization of Somalia. So, continuing to provide this aid, coupled with a continuation of the policing of the waterways around the Gulf of Aden and the Horn of Africa will again bring further stabilization to Somalia. So this increased security for commercial vessels will afford U.S. businesses and international trade partners the freedom to resume economic activities without the threat of having to pay millions of dollars for hostages, damaged vessels, etc. And so aside from the economic perspective, more stabilization efforts will have to assume a more land-based approach. And so every major initiative to restore stability to Somalia has met with overwhelming failure. Ultimately, before such long-term stabilization efforts can be achieved, a multinational large-scale intervention will have to be organized. Many would argue that this has been tried before and has again met with overwhelming failure, and ultimately motivated more Somalis to turn to insurgency movements out of a perceived violation of sovereignty. However, due to the complex makeup of tribal ties, competing warlords, and the role of extremist groups, any sort of large-scale internal security efforts are a near impossibility. And so such an external intervention will undoubtedly require multinational cooperation and strict oversight from the UN. This will help minimize the resentment and hate that arises from perceived violations of sovereignty, such as the one that occurred with the Ethiopian invasion of 2006, in which many Somalis perceived this intervention as Ethiopia's pursuit to maintain influence over Somalia. And so UN oversight will undoubtedly have to be strict in nature, and any potential war crimes or human rights violations will have to be severely publicly condemned and must not go unpunished or risk discrediting the intervention. Such an intervention will help make clear the UN's and the intervening nations such as the US's unbiased commitment to peace and security in Somalia. Alongside this policy, the US will need to adapt their policies towards, again, a land-based approach, particularly if piracy is to be effectively minimized. Such a policy could include establishing legitimate Somali institutions in which a stronger security environment will allow, or prevent rather, Somali pirates from establishing safe havens and sanctuary within Somalia. And so another land-based approach that the U.S. will need to focus on in the future is the issue of tackling Islamic radicalism. Throughout recent history, U.S. policy has assumed a stance of sort of zero tolerance towards extremism, and military and security initiatives have reflected this. However, the U.S. adopting a more positive stance towards Islam may alienate fewer Somali Muslims. As echoed throughout recent Islamic radicalism studies, the promotion of moderate Islam may do more for the American war on terror, specifically in Somalia, than CIA operations and widespread presence across Somalia has ever done. So, the U.S., in partnership with other members of the international community, reaching out to the moderate Islamic clergy and promising stabilization efforts and humanitarian aid in exchange for the promotion of peaceful moderate Islam, would arguably earn greater respect and cooperation from Somali Muslims than covert CIA missions ever could. Along with these security efforts, long-term stabilization efforts in Somalia will have to be bolstered by economic opportunities. Currently, the nation suffers from a severe lack of a central monetary system that can support investments and protect the Somali population's financial interests. So as a result, many Somalis are forced to turn to illicit activities, including piracy, just as a means of survival. So establishing a strong central monetary system that would be attractive to domestic and international investors would greatly contribute to economic opportunities across Somalia. Furthermore, Making an attractive environment for new banks would bring new capital into the nation and would create reliable lending sources for potential international investors as well as Somali investors. And this again would provide Somalis with the opportunities to finally open legitimate businesses and gain employment outside of the brutal realm of warlordism and extremism. Such proposed new banks would have to be undoubtedly heavily scrutinized in an effort to prevent potential money laundering, which again would in turn fund terrorism. But ultimately, if warlords and terrorist groups were to be limited in their operability due to a restriction of funds stemming from legitimate banking, as well as a lack of volunteers who have turned to legitimacy instead of illicit activities, they're again much less likely to thrive within this nation. So if the U.S. Were to work within a multinational framework to combat warlordism, Islamic extremism, and piracy, as well as promote Islamic moderation and economic growth within Somalia, perhaps Somalia can one day become a nation of stability and opportunity.